On our program tonight, the House of Commons has broken for the holidays. Tonight, we'll look back and ahead with the government House Leader, members of Parliament, and party commentators. We'll talk policy, politics, and predictions. The federal government is poised to announce lifetime pensions for veterans with disabilities, but already veterans are saying the offer isn't good enough. We'll speak with a veterans advocate. The Minister of Crown Indigenous Affairs announces a step towards creating a National Council on Reconciliation. We'll hear from Carolyn Bennett about the government's latest step in healing wounds. And I'll speak with one of the winners in this week's federal by-elections, Liberal Gordie Hogue, who won in the formerly Tory BC riding of South Surrey White Rock, on his big win and what it might mean for Liberal fortunes in BC. Joining me now to look at the kind of fall it's been in Parliament, at least from the government's point of view, I'm joined by the Government House Leader, Bardish Chagger. Good to see you again, Madam Minister. Thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So what kind of a fall has it been? Let's start there, as far as you're concerned from the government side.
I think it's been a productive fall. Looking at the job numbers yesterday, 441,000 jobs created this year, 600,000 jobs created in the last 2 years since our government took office, making the strategic investment so that Canadians can create jobs for Canadians. We're talking about good paying jobs. I think it's been a productive session.
What do you think were the most important bills that were brought to the House, on behalf of things for Canadians?
I would say every piece of legislation is important and benefits Canadians, but things that really stick to my mind was things like C6, the Citizenship Act, where we had said that we would do away with two-tiered citizenship, and a citizen is a citizen is a citizen. So it was good to see Bill C6 get royal assent. I think about the National Committee of Parliamentarians, that National Security Committee of Parliamentarians, the first of its kind, an oversight committee where members of Parliament will be able to look at the national security bodies and actually be able to ask some tough questions in the best interest of Canadians, I think is a historic commitment that we had made and we've been able to deliver on. So that was exciting. And the list goes on.
Okay. Tell me how
FIDA was really exciting too. So Bill C-37, which the previous government had started, and we were able to get into the end zone. Right. It was good to see it.
Trade with Europe. Let me ask you how. Your job is to essentially handle the government agenda through Parliament. How's that changed with I suppose, the increased independence of the Senate, the chamber next door, the upper chamber? How's that complicated your life?
I think what it's done is it's reminded us that the Senate has an important job to do and that they are able to scrutinize legislation. So I think it's really encouraged ministers especially to make sure that senators have answers to their questions. And the sooner we can provide answers to their questions, the faster legislation can move through the Senate. But I think we owe it to Canadians to ensure that we're advancing good legislation, and both the House of Commons and the Senate have a responsibility within the democratic process, and we want to deliver results for Canadians, which is through good legislation.
So let's talk about another a signature piece of legislation was the cannabis legislation. It's now in the Senate. It's headed for the Senate, and senators there, and the Conservative side in particular, are saying they're going to take their time with this bill. The July 1st deadline means nothing to them, but it means something to you. Do you have a message for the Senate?
The Senate knows very well that I have the utmost regard and respect for them. I know they do important work. I look at Bill C-45, the Cannabis Act that you're referring to, and the fact that in the House of Commons we had over 30 hours of debate on Bill C-45. Over 100 speeches were given on Bill C-45. That legislation went to committee. There was about 120 witnesses that appeared on that legislation. So I do believe the Senate knows that it is a commitment we made to Canadians. We want to deliver on the mandate Canadians gave us, but I do also believe that they have important work to do, and I understand in the new year that Minister Wilson-Raybould and Minister Goodale and Minister Putti-Taylor will be appearing in the Senate to ensure that we're providing them the information they need.
Right, but so you've made a case for how the House of Commons dealt with it, the amount of study, the number of witnesses. Some senators saying, great, we want to take the same amount of time and due diligence and go through. You're suggesting, I think, that you've done a lot of work on it. They could benefit from the work you've already done on it. They seem to be saying, some senators, senators saying, we want to do that same kind of work and we'll take as much time as we need to do it. You okay with that?
And we engage with Canadians across the country. As we know, Parliamentary Secretary Bill Blair did a lot of work working with public health agencies and the police and so forth. Well, let's make sure that they're receiving that information. I think we have to let the Senate do the important work the Senate does, and I have no doubt that they want to see the government deliver on our mandate in the best interest of Canadians. So I'm comfortable knowing that they will want us to be able to succeed and that they have a responsibility to do some good work as well.
This would be a lot easier if you didn't have all those independent senators in the chamber. You'd have a majority of Liberals in there if you'd stayed to the old system. You're not going to defend that, though, I know.
I have to say, though, for me, the Senate's always been the upper chamber. It's the sober second thought. So I do believe that they need to do important work. And this is, you know, sometimes people try to talk about the previous government versus our government. This was one of those times where when there was legislation that probably wasn't as great as it should have been coming out of the House of Commons, the Senate did have a responsibility to challenge it. But when it's such a partisan place, we're not working better for Canadians.
And this Senate has done that on a number of pieces of legislation. It's sent back a better bill than was sent to them.
And that's good for Canadians. That's who we're here to work for, whether you're an elected member of Parliament, whether you are a senator. At the end of the day, all of us want to deliver for Canadians, and what we are seeing is more confidence in the Canadian economy. We're seeing more Canadians engaging with government and being part of that democratic process, which I think is good for our country.
Let me ask you some questions about the appointments process in the little bit of time we have left. We have a new ethics commissioner that just got dealt with through the House yesterday, I think, before everybody decided to break and head for the winter break. You've taken some criticism from the opposition side about saying, look, this is supposed to be a consultation process, and it wasn't. You sent them one name a week before you announced the appointment, or even less than a week before you announced the appointment. Is that consultation?
So this is a responsibility that was asked of me. As you know, in June, one of the first things I did when I received that responsibility was to write to both the leaders of the opposition, the recognized parties in the House, to say this is the process. It's been posted. If you would like anyone to be considered, encourage them to apply. So what we did as a government and what we did during the campaign of 2015 was to commit to Canadians that we would bring in a new process for appointments. So that rather than patronage appointments, we were going to have a new, open, transparent, merit-based process where people and Canadians would be able to apply. Because the reality is our best natural renewable resource is our people across this country. So when there is an available position, it's posted online, Canadians are able to apply. There is a rigorous process because we know the requirements for these jobs are important because they're officers of Parliament.
What was your expectation of the opposition parties when you went to them and said, look, you know, did you expect them to send in names of candidates they thought would be good for these jobs, and they didn't?
But they're welcome to.
But did they? Did they propose names to you for an ethics commissioner?
They would have applied online, and if they wanted to inform me of that, they are able to. If they chose not to, that they have that ability as well. What I know is that there is a credible process that we've put in place, and it is an open, transparent, and it's merit-based. So people go through that process, and at the end of the process, some people will have interviews, they will have their screenings done and so forth, and then it will result in a name that I'm comfortable advancing.
Right.
Because
I
I
guess
am the
what they're
person
saying
doing
is,
it.
should you put one name before them? Should you have put 4 names before them and said, here's the 4 candidates we're thinking of. Let's have the opposition input. Do your homework on this and let me know which one you think is the best.
So this is the beauty of the process.
I'm not sure where the consultation process is. If you say, here's the name we're picking.
But that's why they have the ability to raise any concerns. That the nominee that now has actually been approved by the House of Commons appeared at committee.
But that committee was thrown together in less than 24 hours. And they got a name. They said, okay, we'll hustle a hearing in tomorrow.
And that shows that I would say members of Parliament and parties are there actually to work in the best interest of this institution, because they did throw it together to ensure that we could scrutinize the name being put forward so that they could vote on it. And I think that's our responsibility. We needed a person being appointed because we do respect and appreciate the work Ms. Dawson has done. We know we've had to extend that appointment on several occasions, but we needed to be able to put in someone in that post full-time, and we were able to get that done. So I think it's great.
Okay, let's finish on this. You've seen the numbers and the stories. In the first 2 years of the Liberal government, you've passed half as many bills as the Harper government did in its first 2 years of majority government. Does that matter to you?
For me, it's actually really about quality of legislation. I don't entirely agree with the comparison because Stephen Harper, when he was the Prime Minister, had 2 minority governments prior to receiving a majority mandate from Canadians, which means they were able to prepare legislation and have it in the pipeline. And once they received their majority, they
started pushing it through.
They could push it through. For us, Canadians gave us a majority mandate in October 2015, and that's when we started working. But what we are doing differently than the previous government is that we promised that the voice of Canadians would be heard in the House of Commons. Members of Parliament would be representing their constituents. We would have more rigorous debate. And that's why when you look at the cannabis legislation as an example, over 31 hours of debate, over 100 speeches in the House of Commons, over 120 witnesses appearing at committee. This is scrutinizing legislation to ensure it's good legislation in the best interest of Canadians. Something the previous government was not able to do was make those strategic investments to grow the economy. We've been able to do that in 2 years. 600,000 jobs in 2 years. The greatest growth of any economy in the G7. So Canadians have more confidence, and we did that by lowering taxes on middle-class Canadians and increasing them on the wealthiest 1% of Canadians. We did that by giving more money to families with children that need it most through the Canada Child Benefit. And what we've been hearing is those families are more comfortable, they are able to provide for their kids, and they are putting more confidence in our economy, which is good for our country.
All right. Government House Leader Bardas Chagger, let's talk again in the new year.
I look forward to it.
Take care.
Thank you.
Well, let's follow up now on the kind of false sitting it has been with 3 members of Parliament. Arif Virani is the Parliamentary Secretary for Multiculturalism. Michael Cooper is the Deputy Justice Critic for the official opposition Conservatives. And Sheila Malcolmson is the Status of Women Critic for the NDP. It's good to see you all. Thanks for coming to speak with me.
Thank you.
Let me start with you, Mr. Cooper. How would you characterize the false sitting?
Well, the fall sitting has been a good one for Her Majesty's loyal opposition. We have a strong and united caucus team around our new leader, Andrew Scheer, who has really hit the ground running. We've been working hard to hold this government to account for its many failings and ethical lapses, and to stand up for everyday middle-class Canadians. Meanwhile, it hasn't been such a good fall for the government. We have a government that is plagued by scandal and corruption, a Prime Minister who is under investigation, a Finance Minister who is under investigation, a Minister of Sport who is under investigation. So mired in scandal is this government that they just can't get anything done. They can't get TPP done. They can't get NAFTA done. They can't get softwood done. They can't get pipelines built. And it is a government that is demonstrating, on top of not being able to get anything done, that it is a government that doesn't keep its word. This is a government that, after all, talked a good game about the middle class. But instead of cutting taxes for middle-class Canadians like they promised to do, they've increased taxes, on average $800 for the average middle-class family. Okay. So it's a government that is really on the ropes in a number of substantive areas.
All right. Sheila Malcolmson, what do you think defined the false sitting?
A lot of lost opportunities, and New Democrats trying to propose progressive actions that would help the government implement some of its good intentions in its election platform. We just saw again and again constructive ideas that we brought forward being voted down, whether it was our motion on the right to housing, which the government voted against, whether it was our motion to close the CEO stock option loophole, which really would have actually nailed the real tax cheats, and as opposed to the government's approach of picking on small business, accusing them of using tax evasion when that was so far off the mark. You know, again and again, opportunities for the government to work with us to do things that are better for Canadians, and they just kept voting it down. And then, you know, in my own portfolio, very disappointed to continue to see, even though the unanimous recommendation of the All-Party Committee on Pay Equity a year and a half ago now almost recommended that June 2017 pay equity legislation be tabled in Parliament. The government still hasn't done that, and there's no rationale for them having dragged their feet on having women paid the same for work of equal value.
All right, Mr. Virani, I think by any measure, it's been a bit of a bumpy fall for the government with some of these issues, and we're going to get to you know, how much effect that's had, because when you look at by-election victories and you look at polls, Canadians still seem to be supportive of your government. But are there things you could have done better as a government this fall?
I think what we're doing is what we Canadians expect us to do, and that's listen to Canadians. I think what you're asking about is sort of what's happening here on Parliament Hill, and you're asking about the legislative sessions, and you're asking about question period. And I think if you want me to characterize this fall, I would say it's characterized by obfuscation on the part of the opposition. And I mean that with all sincerity. Obviously, the characterization of Mr. Cooper it's just patently false in terms of inability to get things done, inability to connect with Canadians. What we are doing is we are delivering on a program that we campaigned on, and we've been doing that consistently. We have the best growth in the G7. We have 600,000 jobs we've created since 2015. We have the lowest unemployment rate in a decade. Right. Those are things that the opposition don't want to talk about, so instead they're launching personal attacks on different individuals.
But there are ethics questions around the Minister of Finance. There's investigation into his dealings. There's investigation into the Prime Minister's holiday last Christmas. There are questions about the Minister of Sport and Disabilities. There was what happened on the proposed tax changes. Are you saying there's nothing that happened this fall that couldn't have been done differently, that there weren't some problems?
I'm not saying that, Peter. What I'm saying is that ethics investigations are an important facet of parliamentary democracy and accountability. We've just appointed 3 officers to Parliament as of yesterday at the close of the session, which is a very, very important step forward. In terms of what we're doing with respect to delivering for Canadians, is that we are ensuring that we are listening to Canadians. You talked about sort of some of the proposals that came forward during the summer and were carried through towards the fall. What we've done is we've listened to Canadians. We've scaled back on certain aspects of the proposals. We've fine-tuned them so that they're more carefully tailored, so they're targeted exactly who they're meant to target, which are the corporations that hold the largest amount of wealth and the 3% of Canadian CCPCs that actually use things like methods such as income sprinkling. So we are listening to Canadians, and we're delivering for Canadians.
Let me pick up on your point with your 2 colleagues here. Mr. Virani makes the point that that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about perhaps at times scandal and failings of the government here on Parliament Hill. He's talking about the program that the government puts forward for Canadians. The polls would suggest that Canadians are still buying what the Liberals are selling. There's been no movement for the opposition parties. In some cases, the opposition parties have gone down. They just won. They've taken 2 seats from Conservatives, Mr. Cooper, this fall in by-elections. So what does that say?
Well, if you look at the by-elections, it was obviously disappointing that we lost South Surrey, White Rock by a narrow margin. But when you look at the 4 results, the only party to actually see its share of the vote increase from 2015 was the Conservative Party. And so from that standpoint, it is an encouraging trend. And quite frankly, this is a government that, yeah, the polls may say one thing, but polls change every single day.
Well, they haven't changed a whole lot in the 2 years the government's been in power. The government is still riding high in the polls, and the opposition parties aren't.
Well, look, this is a government that is consistently failing Canadians. Arif referred to the small business tax changes that the government announced. You know, we have seen the government drop the ball on it. They have waited until 2.5 weeks before the new year to impose their changes with respect to income sprinkling, leaving small business owners 2.5 weeks over Christmas to figure out exactly what it's going to mean for them. The Minister of Finance has failed to provide clarity around the changes to passive income. The government has announced this $50,000 figure with respect to passive income, but the finance minister has been unable to say what that $50,000 represents. Okay. Is it $50,000 per shareholder? Is it $50,000 per corporation? Right. It's just another example of this finance minister and this government failing.
Let me move to Sheila Malcolmson. I mean, outside of Parliament, look at polling, look at by-election results. The Democrats are down in the by-election popular support, down in the polls. There's no major traction for your new leader. So to Mr. Virani's point, that there's lots to criticize the government for, but by and large, Canadians seem to like what they're doing. Do you accept that?
This is a government that still is talking a good talk, and I certainly hear from New Democrats, the Trudeau government said they're going to act on climate change. They said they're going to act on pay equity. They said they're going to fix the Navigable Waters Protection Act. So those intentions, I think, are reflected in, still some goodwill, obviously, on the part of the public. The disappointment that I'm hearing from the people that are most politically active back at home is this government's got a majority. They're 2 years into their mandate. A lot of the legislative fixes were written for them by civil society organizations, when it wasn't clear who was going to win the election. We need to move so fast to restore habitat protection to the Fisheries Act. We need to fix the Environmental Assessment Act. We have to move off Stephen Harper's targets on climate change and really get serious about ratcheting down emissions. 2 years in, that hasn't happened. And so I think as we get close to the 2019 election, I think that the alignment of the intentions, democratic reform, this was going to be the last election after first past the post. So the people that I'm hearing from, who are the most politically and passionately engaged, are seeing the government's failure to implement its 2015 campaign commitments, and I believe that's going to catch up with them next time we go to the polls.
Mr. Virani.
So I'd love to respond to all of these aspects, and I'll be very frank, Peter. I think the questions that the opposition is directing to the government should probably be directed more appropriately to the leader of the opposition, because since Andrew Scheer has come to the fore as the leader of the opposition, he's managed to shrink his caucus by 2. The fact that we won in Lac Saint Jean, we won in South Surrey White Rock, demonstrates exactly as you noted that for Canadians at their doors, Canadians who are concerned about things that affect them and their families, what we are doing and what we are implementing is resonating for them. And what are we doing? We are implementing a Canada Child Benefit, and this year we strengthened it by indexing it. We're implementing, Ms. Malcolmson has raised the housing point. It's a very valid point. It's a point that we share a commonality of concern with the NDP. What we've done is implement the first national housing strategy this country has ever seen, which includes a human rights-based approach to incorporating and ensuring accountability on housing. That's the kind of delivery that Canadians want to see.
In 2 years.
They're seeing that, and they're recognizing that, but that by implementing things like the Canada Child Benefit, by strengthening the CCP, by reducing taxes as the very first act that this government took, that's the kind of impact that affects them directly, and that's what that is resonating with them, and that's the message the Prime Minister continues to take to
Where
Canadians.
are we when we come back at the end of January, Mr. Cooper? Where does the opposition pick up?
Well, the government still has a lot to answer with respect to the small business tax changes. Of course, the ethical lapses of the finance minister are staggering, and he is going to have to continue to answer questions that he refuses to answer. We're talking, after all, about a finance minister who misled Canadians, saying that his assets were in a blind trust when they were not. This is a finance minister that hid from the Ethics Commissioner, an offshore company. This is a finance minister that sold 680,000 Morneau Chappelle shares a week before his tax changes, saving him a cool $500,000. The minister said...
we know that story.
You know the story.
We should expect, and you would suggest we should expect, and rightfully so, more questions about integrity and ethics for the government when the House comes back.
With a record like that, there's only one thing for the minister to do, and that is resign, and we will continue to call on the minister to resign. And another big issue...
Sheila, Malcolm, sorry, where do we come back? What's the focus for the NDP in the new year?
We come back pushing for implementation. If the government's serious about its promises, then we are looking for legislation that implements that agenda, introduced early enough that we actually can get some results for Canadians. There's no point expanding the Canada Child Benefit if there aren't childcare spaces to spend that in. And we're seeing this report just even this week saying childcare costs have gone up. There's terrible affordability problems for people across the country, and we're hearing it back at home. We've got commitments that go so far out beyond the next agenda that's not enough for people in the country right now. So we're pushing for results, and we're looking for some action so that the government actually walks its talk.
All right, quick final comment. from you, Mr.
I think what you should expect is more continued support for Canadians in terms of what affects them in their everyday lives. You should look for support from the government in terms of legislative initiatives, policy initiatives, and guidelines that will help Canadians in terms of their day-to-day livelihood. You should look for things such as more inclusive and diverse policies. You should look for things that relate to Indigenous reconciliation. As a very tangible note, we've committed publicly that we will be tabling the first Indigenous Language Protection Act as part of responding to TRC calls to action. That's the kind of thing that we will be delivering on, continue to deliver on. And for small businesses that Mr. Cooper has mentioned, they should look forward to having their taxes reduced as of January 1st, as we committed to do.
All right, well, lots to cover when we get back together in the new year, but thank you all for your time today, and have a good break, more than anything else, and the best of the season. Take care.
Best of the season to all the listeners. Thank you.
Happy New Year, Peter.
Minister Bennett, thank you very much.